The canyon burned with the colors of a dying sun, a molten sky pouring red and gold across the high bluffs until even the stones seemed to bleed. Wind slipped through the sage in soft, restless sighs, carrying the dry rattle of seeds and the distant cry of a coyote. 5 riders dismounted at the edge of a shallow ravine where the earth had been turned and tamped, a lonely mound of dirt beneath a crooked wooden cross. The smell of pine pitch and raw soil clung to the cooling air. Jed Calder dropped to one knee, hat in hand, his broad shoulders stooped as though the weight of every mile they had ridden pressed down at once. He was a soldier once, blue coat and brass buttons, and though he had traded uniform for trail dust, the bearing remained. His hands were scarred from war and work alike, and when they trembled, he curled them into fists. Luke Parnell stood a little apart, coat collar turned high, the gleam of a gambler's watch chain catching the last streaks of light. Cards and chance had always favored Luke, but tonight his gray eyes held no mischief. He pulled a silver coin from his pocket, rolling it across his knuckles before letting it slip into the mound as though buying Sam Hollis a ticket to the next world. Clara McGraw, read to anyone who'd ever met her, knelt opposite Jed. The sunset caught in her hair like sparks on copper, her rifle slung easy across her back. Dust streaked her cheeks, but her eyes stayed dry. She had learned long ago that tears did no good on the trail. Sam had been her match with a rifle, the only one who could beat her on a 100-yard shot, and now the echo of his laugh haunted the evening air. Mateo Ruiz crossed himself and murmured a prayer in Spanish, the words low and quick, the cadence of a man who knew God listened best when one didn't waste time. His wide-brimmed sombrero shadowed a face weathered by sun and miles of cattle drives, but the dark grief in his eyes was plain. Elijah Boone lingered at the edge of the circle, lean as a pine sapling, the youngest of them all. Barely 20, he carried the quiet of the wilderness in his bones. A tracker's eyes, sharp and unyielding, flicked from the fresh mound to the distant ridge where the land met the sky. Something there caught his attention, a flicker of movement too deliberate to be the play of wind. Jed pressed his palm flat against the loose earth. Sam Hollis didn't fall to chance, he said, his voice a low rasp cut by years of dust and smoke. Someone put a bullet in him and left him for the buzzards. I aimed to see that someone answer for it. The words hung in the canyon like a shot that never echoed back. Luke's coin gleamed in the fading light as he crouched beside Jed. You speak my mind, he said, and drew a knife from his boot. Without ceremony he sliced a thin line across his palm. Blood welled dark and bright. He held it out, daring the others. Red met his gaze and nodded. For Sam, she said, and cut her own hand. Her blood smelled sharp, metallic, mixing with the sage. Mateo followed, his prayer unfinished but his resolve clear. Elijah stepped forward last, silent as the dusk, his knife swift and sure. Jed opened his palm with a single hard stroke and extended it into the center of their circle. One by one they joined, blood mingling in the dying light, warm against the cooling air. The wind rose, carrying the scent of iron and dust. We hunt him, Jed said. Across every mile of this cursed west if we have to. We don't stop till the man who killed Sam Hollis lies in the dirt the same. Their joined hands tightened, a knot of flesh and will. The canyon seemed to lean closer, as if the land itself bore witness. From the ridge came a faint metallic glint, moonlight catching steel. Elijah's eyes narrowed. He said nothing, only tilted his head slightly toward the horizon. Red followed his gaze and caught the shimmer. A lone rider stood silhouetted against the bruised sky, still as a carving. Luke's hand drifted to the revolver on his hip. We've got company, he murmured. Jed rose in one fluid motion, every inch the soldier once more. He studied the figure, a dark outline against the last flare of day. No banner, no greeting, only silence. After a long moment the rider wheeled and melted into the growing dark, horse and men swallowed by distance. Scout? Mateo asked. Or a warning, Red replied. Jed replaced his hat and cinched the strap beneath his chin. Either way, he knows we're here. And he knows what we've sworn. He looked to each of them, the fading light carving hard lines across their faces. We ride at first light. No trail too cold. No canyon too deep. They nodded as one. Around them the desert shifted into night, stars pricking the indigo sky. Coyotes wailed, long mournful notes that seemed to rise from Sam's grave itself. Luke struck a match and lit a lantern, its small flame throwing shadows that danced across the rough cross of cedar branches. To Sam Hollis, he said softly, May the men who shot you find no rest until we bring him down. The lantern flickered, the flame bowing to a sudden gust, and then steadied, as if agreeing. They lingered only long enough to let the silence settle again. Each man and woman felt the gravity of the vow tighten around their hearts like a cinched rope. What lay ahead? Desert storms, gun smoke, perhaps their own deaths. No one spoke of it. The West asked for silence before it demanded blood. Jed mounted first, the leather creak of his saddle loud in the hush. Red swung onto her chestnut mare with easy grace, rifle glinting faintly. Mateo checked the sky, muttered another prayer, and followed. Luke's coin flashed once more as he flicked it into the night, a gambler's final bet tossed to fate. Elijah brought up the rear, eyes still on the ridge where the stranger had vanished. Behind them the lantern's glow faded to a single ember and then was gone, leaving only the endless stars. The trail ahead stretched black and uncertain, a ribbon through wild country where justice came on horseback and oaths were sealed in blood. They rode into it without a word, the promise of vengeance burning hotter than the desert sun that would greet them come morning. Dawn leaked across the horizon like a pale wound, revealing a desert that seemed to stretch into forever. Dust swirled around the horses' hooves as the 5 riders pushed west, the silence between them as heavy as the guns at their sides. Jed Calder led with a soldier's precision, scanning the land with eyes trained to find trouble long before it showed itself. Behind him, Luke Parnell slouched in the saddle, playing the part of the easy gambler, though his hand never strayed far from his revolver. Red McGraw rode beside Mateo Rees, her copper hair catching the first thin rays of sun, while young Elijah Boone tracked every broken twig and twisted footprint with the focus of a hawk. By midday the heat came down like a hammer. The desert shimmered, and sweat streaked their faces as the horses labored through soft drifts of sand. The trail gave them their first sign in a shallow arroyo, a single silver cartridge glinting where no bullet should have been. Elijah crouched, brushing grit from the casing. "Black Comet make these," he murmured. "I've seen their work before." The words carried across the silence like a distant gunshot. They pressed on until the sun bled out behind the mesas. The next settlement was little more than a leaning saloon and a handful of sagging shacks, the air thick with the sour scent of whiskey and sweat. The batwing doors creaked as they entered. Eyes followed them from the gloom, men with faces like dried leather, hands too near their belts. Jed asked about Sam Hollis and silver bullets. The barkeep polished a glass and claimed ignorance, but a scarred cowhand at the far table laughed low and cruel. Black Comet riders came through, the men said, voice slurred with drink. Left a ranch burning east of here. Maybe your friend had it coming. Luke's smile was a flick of lightning. Care to repeat that? The cowhand rose, big and mean, and the saloon shifted like a snake about to strike. 3 more men pushed back their chairs, boots grinding the floorboards. The first swing came fast. Luke ducked, the punch splintering a shelf behind him. Jed moved like a soldier on a battlefield, driving his shoulder into another attacker. Red's rifle but snapped up under a jaw with a crack like splitting kindling. Mateo's heavy boots sent a table skidding, clearing space in a storm of curses. When the dust settled, the cowhand lay moaning amid broken glass. Jed hauled him upright. "Where exactly?" he demanded. Blood ran from the man's lip as he spat out the answer. 2 days' ride, East Canyon Pass. They left to the sound of rattling shutters and whispered curses. Night swallowed them whole, the desert cold and wide. Red wiped a smear of blood from her knuckles but said nothing. The burned ranch appeared near midnight, a blackened scar under a sky pricked with hard stars. Smoke still lingered, bitter and ghostly. Fences sagged inward, and the earth held the faint warmth of recent fire. Elijah moved through the ashes like a shadow, reading the ground with patient eyes. 7 riders, he said vinily. 1 horse carries extra weight. Luke stared into the ruins, his face hard to read. "Some deserved better," he muttered, voice barely above the wind. The desert gave no comfort. Days blurred into one another, sun that seared by noon, cold that bit at night. Sandstorms rose without warning, walls of grit that swallowed the world until the riders became silhouettes inside a swirling void. After each storm, the canyons echoed strangely, as if the rocks themselves whispered secrets just out of reach. At a lonely waterhole they found a scrap of black cloth snagged on thorn, the edge scorched. Mateo turned it over in his fingers. "They mock the darkness," he said quietly. "Black Comet believe the night belongs to them." Farther west, rails cut across the wasteland like a scar. A freight train hissed in the dawn, bound for the mining camps. Jed paid the conductor and the last coins some had carried, and they climbed into a rattling boxcar heavy with the smell of coal and dampwood. A lone drifter occupied the far corner, head brim low, rifle across his knees. He watched them without blinking. Jed offered a measured greeting. The man only tipped his hat, boots powdered with the same silver-gray dust Elijah had seen at the burned ranch. Hours passed with the steady clatter of wheels and the press of unspoken tension. When the whistle wailed for the next stop, the drifter rose and vanished between cars without a word, leaving the scent of gun oil and unease. That night the moon was a thin knife in the sky. They camped in a dry wash, stars sharp as flint overhead. The ambush came without warning, first the hiss of an arrow, then the crack of distant rifles. Horses screamed and bolted. Luke dove behind a boulder, cold barking flame into the dark. Jed snapped commands, soldier instincts honed to a razor. Red fired with icy precision, each shot a spark in the night. Mateo dragged the terrified horses to cover while Elijah melted into the shadows, circling to flank unseen foes. A bullet ripped Luke's sleeve and scored his arm. He bit down a curse and fired back, but the attackers were ghosts in the rocks. Then silence, sudden and complete, broken only by the echo of their own breathing. They found nothing but a single spent silver cartridge gleaming under moonlight and the acrid tang of gunpowder drifting on the cold air. Whoever had struck knew the land too well to be caught. By dawn Luke's arm was bound and his face drawn. He tried for swagger, but the near miss gnawed at him. Jed watched him with a soldier's patience, something unreadable in his eyes. Old rivalries began to stir like snakes in the sand, arguments about the route, the risk, the worth of vengeance. Red kept her doubts close, but they weighed heavy. In quiet moments she wondered if justice truly waited at the end of a gun barrel or if they were only feeding the desert more ghosts. Yet Sam's easy grin haunted her, the memory of his laughter cut short by a single shot, and the thought hardened her resolve. When the sun climbed again, painting the mesas in copper and rose, they mounted without a word. The trail of the Black Comet riders stretched ahead, marked by silver gleams and ashes, a path of taunts through a wilderness that showed no mercy. Their oath pressed on them like the heat itself, unyielding, inescapable, as they rode deeper into the vast and waiting west. The moon hung low and cold as they entered the maze of crimson cliffs, its pale light washing the rock walls in a ghostly sheen. The canyon breathed with its own hush, a stillness so deep it seemed to press against their skin. Every hoofbeat echoed twice, once off a stone and again in the chambers of their hearts. Red led her chestnut mare beneath a natural arch, the glow of moonlight painting her copper hair silver. Behind her, Jed scanned the towering walls with a soldier's caution, his eyes narrowing at every flicker of shadow. Wind wound through narrow corridors, carrying whispers that sounded too much like words. Mateo crossed himself under his breath. This place was carved by devils, he said softly, and his voice was swallowed by the stone. Elijah crouched to study the ground where dust lay untouched except for the faint drag of a hoof and the sharp imprint of a spurred boot. They came this way, he murmured. His fingers traced the print as if it might speak. Hours ahead. No more. They moved deeper, the canyon twisting back on itself, walls glowing with a faint red fire in the moonlight. An owl hooted from somewhere above, the sound sudden and hollow, setting Luke's nerves on edge. He laughed once, sharp and thin. Owls are ghosts, he muttered, but the attempt at levity rang false. The trail led them to a basin walled by jagged cliffs. There, the earth bore fresh scars, boot tracks, the ash of a recent fire, a silver cartridge left like a calling card. Jed lifted it between two fingers, the metal cold even in the desert night. They're close, Red whispered. A sudden scrape of stone snapped every head around. From the shadows stepped two riders clad in dust-dark coats, the Black Comet sigil faintly visible on their shoulders. Moonlight struck the steel of drawn revolvers. "Evening," one called, his voice like gravel dragged across iron. "You folks look lost." Jed's hand hovered near his holster. "Not lost," he answered, tone even. "Looking for men who murdered our friend." The second rider grinned, teeth flashing white in the moonlight. "That's so. Maybe we've met." He cocked the hammer of his revolver and the sound cracked the silence. Time slowed. Red's rifle came to her shoulder, the moon catching the barrel. Luke eased a step to the left, eyes calculating angles, while Elijah melted toward a shadowed ledge. Mateo shifted, his breathing quick, a prayer half-formed. The first rider moved to speak again, but his partner's finger twitched. A shot erupted, ricocheting off stone with a scream of sparks. Red fired back in the same heartbeat, her bullet striking the canyon wall inches from the man's head. Jed lunged sideways, drawing and firing in a blur. Chaos shattered the night. The second outlaw's shot caught Mateo high on the arm, spinning him from the saddle with a cry. Luke dove for cover behind a boulder, his revolver spitting flame. Elijah's rifle cracked from the shadows, dropping the first rider where he stood. The second wheeled his horse, desperate to flee, but Red's final shot rang out and the men tumbled into the dust. Silence returned as suddenly as it had left, broken only by Mateo's labored breathing. Red was off her horse and at his side in an instant, tearing a strip from her sleeve to staunch the bleeding. "Through and through," she said, voice steady though her hands trembled. "He'll live." Jed crouched beside the fallen scouts. One still breathed, chest rising shallow and slow. Jed gripped the man's coat and pulled him close. "Who sent you?" he demanded. The outlaw's eyes flickered, a faint smile ghosting his lips. "Not who you think," he rasped, and the light went out of him. Luke knelt beside the other corpse, searching pockets. He found nothing but a tarnished locket, oddly delicate. Inside lay a single playing card, the ace of spades, creased and worn. He turned it over in his fingers, unease tightening his jaw. "This isn't their style," he muttered. "Black Comet don't carry trinkets." Jed stared at the card, a memory rising unbidden. Sam Hollis's last night flashed before him, the dying scout leaning close, whispering words Jed had half dismissed in the chaos of grief. "Beware the hand you trust most." At the time it had seemed like delirium. Now it struck like a knife. He looked around the circle of faces. Luke, eyes shadowed and calculating. Red, fierce and unwavering. Elijah, silent and sharp as the canyon wind. Mateo, pale but defiant. Doubt crept through Jed's chest like cold water. Sam's warning hadn't been about a stranger. It had been about one of them. The canyon seemed to tighten, walls leaning closer as if eager to hear what would come next. Jed forced his voice low and calm. "We move before dawn," he said. "They'll have heard the shots." Red tied the final knot in Mateo's bandage and met Jed's gaze, her own unreadable. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking Sam died because someone he trusted let it happen," Jed replied. He let the words hang, heavy as the rock around them. No one answered. An owl called again, long and mournful, echoing off the crimson cliffs until it sounded like the voice of the dead. The five of them listened, each lost in their own shadowed thoughts, while the moon drifted behind a veil of cloud and the canyon of echoes lived up to its name. Night settled heavy over the canyon, the kind of darkness that swallows flame and thought alike. Their campfire fought against it, a trembling circle of amber light in a world of black. The wind carried the taste of coming rain, sharp and metallic. Mateo lay against a bedroll, arm bound tight, his face pale but eyes alert. Red fed a thin branch to the fire, sparks snapping like gunfire before vanishing into the void. Jed sat apart, elbows on knees, staring into the flames as if the answers to Sam's murder might rise from the coals. Sam's warning pulsed through his mind, "Beware the hand you trust most," until it became a drumbeat in his skull. Across the fire, Luke Parnell's profile flickered in orange and shadow. The gambler idly rolled a silver coin across his knuckles, the glint catching Jed's eye like a sudden blade. Elijah returned from a perimeter check, the tracker stepped silent on the dust. "No sign of riders," he said. "But the storm's close. Smells of it." Lightning flared far to the west, a white wound across the horizon. Jed lifted his gaze to Luke, voice low but edged with iron. "Funny thing about that card you found on the scout. Ace of spades. Same you keep tucked behind your hatband." Luke's hand stilled on the coin. He gave a slow smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Ace travels with every gambler," he said. "Means luck. Means nothing." Red's gaze sharpened. "Means plenty when it's on a dead man who knew we were coming." The fire popped, sending a spray of sparks skyward. Jed leaned forward, his face carved with shadow. "Sam whispered before he died. Told me to watch the hand I trust. I didn't understand then. I do now." Silence stretched until it hit. Luke's grin faltered. "You think I put a bullet in Sam," he said, voice pitched between disbelief and something darker. "We rode 100 trails together." "We all know your debts," Mateo said softly, accent thick with fatigue. "Cards and whiskey cost more than pride. Black Comet pay well to those who guide them." Lightning forked closer, the thunderous slow, rolling growl. Luke rose, hands open but tense. "I paid those debts my way. That don't make me a traitor." Jed stood to meet him. "Tell it straight. Were you with them the night Sam died?" For a heartbeat, Luke looked ready to lie, but the storm's wind tore through the canyon, bending the fire sideways. His shoulders sagged. "I never aimed to kill him," he said, voice barely audible. "I only meant to scare him off the drive. They wanted the herd easy to take. I thought he'd walk away." Red's breath hissed between her teeth. "You led them to him." Luke's eyes shone with something that might have been regret. "I warned him to stay out of the canyon, but Sam was stubborn." He swallowed hard, knuckles whitening around the coin. "I heard the shot before I could stop it." The campfire guttered in a sudden gust, throwing their faces into fleeting darkness. When light returned, Jed's hand rested on the grip of his Colt. "You sold him for silver," he said, each word heavy as a hammer. "I tried to fix it," Luke pleaded. "Paid them back double to keep you safe. That's why we've lived this long." Red stepped closer, eyes blazing. "You think that buys back his blood?" Luke's glance darted to the canyon rim where thunderheads boiled. "I never wanted it like this." He took a step backward. "I can still make it right." "Don't," Jed warned, the single word sharp as the edge of a knife. But Luke spun, leaping onto his horse in a single fluid motion. The silver coin slipped from his hand and landed in the dust with a muted chime. Then he kicked hard and the horse lunged into the storm. Jed was already moving, saddling with the speed of a man who'd lived too long in battle. Red swung into her saddle, rifle across her lap. Elijah mounted without a sound. Even wounded, Mateo struggled upright, face pale but determined. The chase began under a sky torn open by lightning. Rain fell in sudden sheets, cold needles against their faces. The canyon roared with the storm, echoes crashing like cannon fire. Luke's horse was a ghostly blur ahead, mane flashing white when lightning struck. Jed pressed his mount harder, wind ripping at his coat. Memories of Sam's easy laugh burned in his chest, fueling every stride. Red rode tight behind, jaw clenched, hair plastered to her face by rain. Elijah veered along the high ledges, a shadow among shadows, seeking a path to cut Luke off. Mateo followed with grim resolve, pain etched deep but eyes fixed forward. Thunder rolled so loud it swallowed the pounding of hooves. Water poured through the narrow passes, turning the ground to slick red clay. Luke's horse skidded but recovered, and still he pressed on, driven by desperation and something like guilt. A fork of lightning split the sky, dazzling the world in stark white. For an instant Jed saw Luke glance back, eyes wide, a flash of something unreadable, fear or defiance. Then the darkness slammed shut again. They gained ground where the canyon widened. Red lifted her rifle but lowered it just as quickly, breath harsh. "Not yet," she muttered. Jed urged his horse alongside, heart hammering. The storm's fury drowned all sound until only the relentless pursuit remained, the promise of justice, the betrayal of a brother, and the roar of heaven above as the night swallowed them whole. Gray light seeped over the horizon as they reached the edge of the abandoned mining town, a husk of splintered boards and leaning walls etched against the paling sky. Wind carried the dry rattle of loose shutters and the bitter smell of old smoke. The storm had passed, but puddles still slicked the rutted street, mirroring streaks of dawn like molten steel. Jed reined in, scanning the crooked rooftops, every sense sharpened. Somewhere beyond the silence, Luke Parnell waited with men who had already tasted blood. A church bell hung cracked in its steeple, motionless as a tombstone. The town itself seemed to hold its breath. Red eased her mare forward, eyes narrow, rifle resting across her thighs. Mateo rode behind her despite the bandaged arm that throbbed with each heartbeat, just set in quiet defiance. Elijah slipped away into the shadowed alleys without a word, the tracker becoming part of the morning mist. The first shot came from the blacksmith's ruin, a muzzle flash that tore the quiet apart. Jed dove from the saddle, rolling into the shelter of a water trough as bullets screamed down the street. Horses bolted, hooves clattering like thunder. Red dismounted in a single motion and returned fire, her shot cutting clean through a second-story window. A cry followed, short and sharp. The Black Comet riders emerged from the wreckage like wraiths, their long coats whipping in the rising wind. 5 in all, faces hidden behind bandanas black as midnight. Gunfire sparked from every doorway. Dust leapt from the ground in angry fountains. Mateo pressed against a fallen beam, revolver steady despite the blood seeping through his sleeve. He fired with grim patience, each shot deliberate, each breath a victory. Jed sprinted across the street, the sun's first rays slicing through drifting smoke. A bullet grazed his hat brim, tearing felt but missing flesh. He dropped behind a toppled wagon and answered with 2 quick blasts that sent one rider sprawling into the dirt. The air smelled of powder and splintered pine. From the corner of her eye, Red caught a flicker of movement on a collapsed balcony. She pivoted, rifle rising. Her shot split the morning air, the echo cracking across the silent hills. A dark figure toppled, rifle clattering from lifeless hands. Her heart pounded, but her aim never wavered. The fight raged through the skeletal streets, every doorway a threat, every shadow a muzzle flash. Elijah reappeared from the back alley like a phantom, knife flashing as he pulled another gunman into the dust. Mateo's revolver thundered until the last chamber clicked empty, but still he stayed on his feet, face set with stubborn fire. Then, as suddenly as it began, the gunfire faltered. Smoke curled through beams of new sunlight. Only one figure remained, retreating toward the shattered church at the town's heart. Luke Parnell paused beneath the ruined bell tower, coat torn and eyes bright with something between rage and regret. He raised his pistol but did not fire, instead turning to vanish through the gaping doors. Jed followed, steps slow but unstoppable. Inside, the church smelled of damp wood and ancient dust. Morning light poured through a broken stained glass window, painting shards of crimson and gold across the cracked floorboards. Luke stood at the altar where the pews lay in ruin, the barrel of his revolver lowered but not released. "You shouldn't have come," Luke said, voice hoarse. "This was never meant for you." Jed's Colt hung at his side, grip loose but ready. "Sam was my brother," he answered. "You led him to his death. I had to come." Luke's smile was a crooked shadow. "I tried to buy him time. They were only supposed to scare him. I never pulled the trigger." His gaze flicked to the ragged light, and for a moment he looked like the boy who once rode beside them under kinder skies. "I wanted to walk away clean. But there's no clean in this world, is there?" Jed took a slow step forward, boots whispering against the dust. "You can still choose. Drop the gun. Face what's left of the law." Outside, the wind rose, rattling the bell with a hollow clang. Luke's fingers tightened. "Law," he said, a bitter laugh scraping his throat. "Out here, law is whoever draws first." The silence stretched, heavy as judgment. Then Luke moved, a blur of desperation. Jed's revolver roared once. The shot echoed through the hollow nave, a single thunderclap beneath the cracked bell. Luke staggered, eyes wide with surprise, and fell among the shattered pews. For a heartbeat the church held nothing but the sound of wind and the faint drip of rainwater from the roof. Jed lowered his weapon, chest heaving. Red and Elijah appeared in the doorway, faces pale in the slanting light. Mateo followed, leaning heavily against the frame but standing tall. No one spoke. Together they carried Luke's body into the newborn sun. They buried him beside Sam on a rise just beyond the town, where wild sage bent in the morning breeze. The soil was soft from the night's rain, the scent of earth sharp and clean. Jed placed Luke's silver coin atop the mound, its surface catching the first full blaze of day. When the last stone was set, they stood in silence as the sun climbed higher, painting the mesas and fire in gold. The oath they had sworn in a distant canyon was fulfilled, but its weight did not lift. Red wiped a sleeve across her eyes and turned toward the endless west. Mateo laid a hand on the cross and whispered a prayer in Spanish, the words scattering with the wind. Elijah looked back once at the twin graves before leading the horses toward the trail. Jed lingered the longest, the breeze tugging at his coat, the smell of gunpowder still faint on the air. He thought of Sam's laughter, of Luke's easy grin before cards and greed had carved their fate. Frontier justice had been served, but there was no triumph in it, only the quiet truth that vengeance carries its own shadow. When at last he mounted, the rising sun bathed the land in a light so fierce it seemed to burn away the night. They rode out together, for shadows stretching long across the awakening desert, leaving behind the ghost town, the graves, and the heavy silence of justice paid in full.